Excellent. Yes, it happens. There's still some people sort of joining, but we might get things underway this afternoon. It's lovely to see a great group from various parts of the country, from the looks of it, online today. I'm joined by Rohan Butler from Holstein Australia, who will give me a hand again today to deliver this next webinar in this series, which is focusing on dairy strength. Similar format to what we've run sort of before, so we've got a little bit of content prepared for you, but certainly tried to keep it fairly tight to give opportunities for questions and things. So please feel free to use the chat box to throw some questions our way, and we'll do our best to kind of catch them either through the presentation or at the end. If there's something unclear, just sing out so we can try and work through that. It's an interesting topic today, dairy strength. So looking forward to your observations and your questions as we go through. No, just give me a tick here. Click the wrong button. So with any luck, you should be able to see the presentation, and I'm going to make that box smaller so that hopefully we can see that. How are we going, Rohan? Can you see things at your end okay? And I don't have any funny boxes covering things up. Excellent. That's good to hear. So as I mentioned, today is all about the dairy strength composite ABV. And dairy strength is one of the new suite of composite traits that were released with the April 2020 ABVs. We had quite a lot of new traits in April that include a new rump composite ABV, dairy strength, feet and legs. At the same time, we also did some updates on memory system and overall type. You also would have seen a new trait called heel depth that also was added in April. So today's focus is just specifically on that dairy strength composite. So just thinking visually sort of about where dairy strength is, it's not just one part of the body. As Rohan will go through, there's a number of aspects of the cow that are involved in dairy strength. It's a nice summary sort of breeding value that takes into account more than one individual trait. And I suppose, at the end of the day, why are these sorts of things important? We know that the type traits as a group, they are important in terms of helping us build a kind of a functional cow, a cow that's got the ability to last a long time. We know that overall type is strongly related to longevity traits. So animals with a stronger overall type do last longer. And this is an opportunity to break that down into some of its components and see how they operate. And now Rohan and I, we've had lots of good discussions around the dairy strength ABV. This is it's a new trait. That's a new ABV for us, and we're all learning kind of about it and how it works. And one of the ways that we can learn about the trait is by thinking about the other traits that it's related to. And we can use an analysis of correlations, so relationships between traits, to help us understand what things come along with dairy strength and what traits might be pulling against dairy strength that might be negatively correlated or kind of working in opposite directions. When we talk about correlations, this is looking at a big population level. So on average, animals that are stronger for dairy strength are also stronger for angularity. They're also stronger for muzzle width, and they also have higher overall type. Now, it doesn't mean that all animals follow that same pattern, but just on average across the population, these are the sorts of trends that we observe. So some of the traits that are positively correlated with dairy strength are the ones that I've listed there. Angularity and muzzle width, chest width, these are all strongly and positively correlated with dairy strength. Muzzle width, overall type too, to maybe a slightly lesser extent. Pin width, the rump composite are also ones that are moderately but positively correlated with dairy strength. There's also an association with production as well. So in general, the ones that are cows and bulls that have higher dairy strength also are stronger in terms of production. But the relationship there is maybe perhaps a little bit weaker than it is with other traits like angularity. There are some other traits that have a more interesting relationship, and these are ones that we, still want to better understand. Across the population, there's perhaps a pulling, push-pull sort of relationship with longevity. So the stronger the dairy strength, we see perhaps more poorer results for the survival ABV, the longevity ABV. Same is true for fertility and cell count. As well as memory system and cavities, which I thought you might have been kind of interested in. Although the relationships with memory system and cavities are a little bit more neutral than the three above it. When we think about how we calculate the dairy strength ABV, one of the things that's fundamentally changed about our data streams is the introduction quite some time ago of Holstein Australia's calculation of a dairy strength score. And it's really only this year that we've been able to bring that dairy strength score in, even though it's been calculated and assessed for a long time. It's only been this year that we've brought that into the ABV system, which has enabled us to produce the dairy strength ABV. So for current cows that are classified, over the past sort of 10 or a bit more years, the dairy strength score assessed by Holstein Australia is the main piece of information that contributes to the dairy strength ABV. But in cases where we don't have that piece of information, perhaps in older animals that are still part of the pedigrees of the animals that we have today, we'll use the component traits of dairy strength to produce that breeding value. So those component traits are angularity, chest width, body depth, muzzle width, loin strength, and stature. So those component traits will contribute to dairy strength ABV in the case where we don't have that dairy strength composite score from the breed association. At this point, when we get into the tricky details of the classification itself, I'd like to introduce Rohan Butler. Rohan is Holstein Australia's Improvement and Research Manager, maybe for one more day, and soon transitions to the role of CEO at Holstein Australia. It's great to have Rohan involved in the webinar today to walk us through some of the individual traits and how they're actually assessed.
Excellent, thanks Michelle. So if you want to roll on to the next slide there, we'll get started. So, I mean, a little bit about dairy strength. Michelle mentioned the trait groups that are involved in the group in here, and there's quite a number of traits that contribute to dairy strength: stature, muzzle width, chest width, body depth, angularity, bone quality, and also loin strength, which for those who have participated in these series before, we talked a bit about loin strength in the rump trait as well. It contributes there as well. So if we start with stature, this is measuring the cow, and we measure the cow at the back of the hips, not at the front, and we actually measure cows currently in centimetres, and then that's converted into a linear code based on the linear code is converted based on the centimetre measurement that we take. So the classifiers will usually, when they're doing evaluation, will take a part of the yard or the thing, and they'll have a known height either on a fence or somewhere around the yard. Then they'll make sure the cow goes past that part of the yard, and that'll give them a reference point to try and make that an accurate assessment of the height of the cow. And then that gets converted to a linear code, and the linear code is, that conversion, you might have a heifer that's 145 centimetres. Well, the linear code will vary based on how old that cow is, how old she was when she calved. There's probably a few other contributing factors there I can't think of straight off the top of my head, but they're the main ones that'll do that. So that if you have a cow that's calved as a 3-year-old and she's quite tall, well, that's understandable why that cow would be you know, a little bit lower for the linear code. So that's stature, and we look for stature to be an intermediate, what we call an intermediate trait as well. So that, you know, or a Goldilocks trait. We don't, you know, we know that cows that are taller are a bit, you know, have some production inefficiencies and some other issues, or don't fit within some dairy systems. And so cows that are extreme tall at 9, we certainly we will receive a penalty in their contribution to final score and to dairy strength, as well as cows that are extremely short. So we look for cows to be sort of a 6, 7. Which from memory comes out around, for most heifers, that comes out at around about 145, 144 centimetres tall. So if we move to muzzle width, Michelle, I think that's next. So this is muzzle width. This is a trait. I think Australia is actually one of the few countries that does evaluate this trait. We do get some interest from foreign countries. They certainly are interested. I know last time we spoke with the Canadians, they were looking at possibly even implementing this trait. And it's really, it's certainly about the width of the muzzle, and we're looking for, you know, a really wide muzzle so the cow can, so she can, you know, consume grass and is efficient in her work and in turning that, consuming that forage. And it's also about having, you know, wide open nostrils so that cow can breathe properly. You know, it's also about not just about getting air in, it's also about getting heat out, especially in some of those hotter areas. So that's a relatively straightforward trait, I think. So we want to move to the next one. Should be chest width, I think. Yes. So chest. This is a you know, a trait that we talk a lot about, and we had a lot of conversation on. It is an intermediate trait. We don't want really wide-chested cows, and so we're looking at the amount of chest space that is between the front legs. And Richard Anderson, one of our former classifiers, used to talk a little bit about if you're looking at the front part of that cow and you look at that diagram there, and this is something you might do, Mr. Pete Williams, a football euphemism is, how hard is it to kick a football through the front of those legs? You know, is it a really narrow gap in there, or is it a really wide gap that you can see between those? And that's how you differentiate that between cows. And so that would be the easiest way I like to think about that. And again, we're looking for a cow to be intermediate, slightly wider than what we would say is intermediate. So we're looking at the ideal there is a 7 within dairy strength. So the next one is body depth. And so body depth is an interesting trait. Again, it's an intermediate trait. We don't want cows to be too deep. We've known for a long time that there's some cows. There's really extremely deep cows, have some poor relationships with fertility, like you talked about before there, Michelle. And I know, Jan, you asked some questions earlier about some of the previous stuff we talked about the cows being in balance, and this is a trait we very much value and assess based on the proportion of the body depth to the rest of the cow. And I know the line there shows about the depth of the body, but it's also the relative of the depth of the body within that, the point of the shoulder on the back of the leg. And if, you know, you see cows getting, and the diagram sort of does show it, and if you had a line running, horizontal to the ground from the shoulder back, it would be, you know, if you've got lots and lots of body below that point, that's when you're starting to get into too deep. And so that's how we evaluate body depth. We want to move to the next one, Michelle. So angularity, that's a well-discussed trait globally. And historically, it's a trait that is really related to yield and production. And unfortunately, the diagrams, trying to draw a diagram around angularity is really quite difficult. It's certainly showing there on the diagram, looking at the angle of the ribs. When we assess it, it's actually really a three-dimensional trait when we assess angularity. It's also looking at how open and wide those ribs spring, and how much distance is between the ribs. And so you're looking for, and the description at the top about the openness and the angle is probably a better description for that trait. And that's an evaluation. I mean, which historically, you know, if you went back 20 years, angularity was really very hard-nosed about that angle of the ribs, and that evaluation has changed since we implemented the classification system. back in 2007. And some of the results are a little surprising, I guess, when we look. We sort of thought we might see some changes around some of the relationships with Angularity because of that change. But there's some further research to be done, I think, from our end to look at why that's happening and how we might adjust that going forward. So if we want to move to bone quality, Michelle should be next. Excellent, thank you. So, there we go. So your bone quality is really looking at the flatness of the bone at that last bone of the leg of the cow. That's where we're really looking at. We don't look anywhere else for bone quality. Sometimes people will look at the bone on the ribs or somewhere else on the cow. We assess that in one single place, and if you think about those who've got experience with beef, if you think about a beef cow and you look at that really round bone that you see on a beef, that's going to be your one at the far end, one really coarse. And right through it, if you think about some really extremely dairy cows, they'll be that really flat 9 bone. And so we have that as an intermediate. Now we know that the really flat bone is highly related to yield, but we also know that there's some relationships with bone quality, and you want some strength in that leg so that cow, that really fine bone, flat bone is prone to, lameness and locomotion issues. So we look for somewhere between that 5 and a 7 in that diagram to between a 5 and a 9. So we're looking for a 7, with on the flat side, but you want some roundness to it so that it gives that leg some strength. So body condition score. So this is a trait. Body condition score doesn't contribute to the final dairy strength score. It's what we call a research trait, and it's a similar evaluation to the one Dairy Australia uses. We're really looking at how much cover there is between the hip and the pin bones. Is the key factor. You also look around, and if you go and look at cows for body condition score, we're also looking at how much fat cover and fill there is in the back of the pin bones, between the pin and the tail bones as well. And so that's where the classifiers will evaluate that. And like Stature, it's actually a measured trait when we do evaluate it. And so the body condition score value will be adjusted on the score sheet that farmers receive. It will actually, the 1 to 9 code for it will be adjusted for the stage of lactation the cow is in, is the most part of the adjustment that we have on that. So I think the other trait that's included is loin strength. We talked a little bit about loin strength back previously in the rump, so I won't dwell too far on it. If people have questions, feel free to hit me up about loin strength, but it's certainly something that's related with fertility, but it's also related to the strength of the cow and the cow's ability to hold its whole the whole piece and core piece together. Listed on the right hand side there, you have a list of different defects throughout the cow. There's some of them I would say are probably more general defects. This is probably the composite where we include some of the general defects we see, like lax balance, which is really when the classifier looks at the cow and says, well, this cow is made up of different bits of pieces. It's possibly close to ideal even, but it just doesn't quite, the cow's not quite put together. The maths of the system needs just a bit of adjustment with that one. But some of the other ones, like shallow forerib and upright shoulder, are very much related to dairy strength. And just so that people understand that the way the defects work is that once the final score for dairy strength is calculated, the amount on the right there, so by right face it has 1, well, it'll take 1 point off dairy strength, which will then flow through to final score. And so that's how that data would flow through into the breeding values as well, for both dairy strength and for overall type. I think that covers off that.
Ron, could you kind of just explain to us the highlighted bits
here?
Yeah,
so those highlighted traits are the ideals that I talked about as I went through. And so the ideals, if a cow scores on one of those ideal traits, so Stature, we have a range of ideals between 6 and 8. And so if a cow scores on that ideal, she doesn't get any deduction. So effectively, cows start with a a perfect dairy strength score, and then as you work your way through, giving them each linear, they lose points if they differ from being ideal. So if a cow is 5 or 9, she will get a lower dairy strength score than a cow that is 6, 7, or 8. Is the rough way of looking at that.
So if a cow has a linear that has that looks like that pattern highlighted in blue, then she'll get
a higher dairy strength score for sure.
Great. And the percentages that are beside each trait, how do they relate?
That's how each of them contribute. So if a cow is ideal for stature, she gets a 5. That's 5% of the makeup of dairy strength, and so forth through there. So chest width, I think, and angularity are the 2 highest weighted traits within there. Body condition score, it says that there's a 6, 7 ideal, but it's actually still listed as a research trait, which is correct. And so loin strength at 6%. Well, loin strength gets a contribution of 6% to dairy strength, and it must be around 20% into rump as well. So it gets a double hit, so to speak, within the final score.
And the 25%.
And the 25, and then that's just building up into 25%. Dairy strength makes up 25% of overall score. So the final score.
Great. Thanks, Ron.
So this is probably I think this must be my last slide, I think, Michelle. We did that bit of work previously, Michelle, where we looked at the average linear scores for daughters of bulls at certain ABVs or breeding value levels. So across the top there, you have you have a breeding value of 90. And what does the average daughter linear code for those bulls look like? And so, a bull at 90 has, for stature, has daughters are our average of 5.1, whereas a bull at breed average, they average a 7, which is within that ideal range. And then if you go to right through a bull at 110, that's at 8 point, they're 8.6. So there's quite a range between bulls at certain breeding values. So, and that really should help to show people what sort of contribution they can expect to get when they use a bull with a particular breeding value. So some traits might have a really wide range. I'm just scrolling through there, but you look at chest width, it's a range between 3.5 and 6.5. So it's a range of 3 codes between 90 and 110. That's 4 standard deviations. So it's quite it's not quite the range you might expect. So if you want to make an impact on chest width, you really need to be selecting bulls with quite a high chest width breeding value if you're going to want to do that quickly.
Is it true to say, Rohan, so this is an unusual pattern compared to some of the other composites that we've seen, that many of the traits that are around 100 are pretty close to?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and maybe, Michelle, that plays into some of what we're seeing with the correlations. I'm not sure how that is, and we've got a fair bit more work to do in that space to understand that. But like you say, you look at the breed average for stature is within that ideal. Now, maybe we haven't got the ideal for stature right. We need to keep looking at that and keep making sure we do. I think we did when we obviously set it at 7 or 6, 7, 8. We maybe need to look at that and make sure that we've got that right as well. And that's certainly some research we're looking to get started in the next little period. But yeah, I think if you look at, bone quality is pretty close at 6.8. I think we said the ideal for that is a 7. So that's certainly it's interesting. I'm not sure what it's exactly telling us. But it's in some ways it's pleasing to see, I guess.
Yeah. And you mentioned about how things have changed over time. Interested to find out how you would decide to make those changes about ideals. How is that process sort of? How does it come about?
So the way we work that through, Michelle, is that there's a couple of things. Usually, when we did some work back, I think it's in 2012, when we did some work with getting some relationships between the linear type traits and profit trait, direct profit traits such as yield, fertility, survival. So we do some research to establish what those relationships look like between the linear traits. We also then consult with farmers and members, and we have what we call the Development and Classification Committee, that group of farmers sits down and takes that information on board and starts to look at how they might adjust the both the ideals and the weightings within the classification system to adjust that. That's basically that's the Holstein internal process. I'm not exactly sure how other breed societies do that. Other breed societies who use our class system, they set their own ideals and weightings as well with a similar process. But that's our rough process that we work through.
Thanks very much, Ron. It's great to get the inner workings of how those traits operate. So, thinking about dairy strength and how we might use this breeding value down the track, I think the new composites are a useful extra piece of information that farmers can use to augment and improve their breeding program, especially if they want to improve those particular traits. It's nice to have some summary traits. Sometimes it gets overwhelming with 23 or 24 different type traits plus the extra composites. There's lots of numbers to look at, so it's nice to have a summary number to give you an overall picture about a bull or a cow's strength and weaknesses in the broad areas underneath the type. I think we've learned with Dairy Strength ABV, there's many of these areas. We're not necessarily looking for extremes, and I think the relationships between Dairy Strength ABV and other traits mean that we have to think carefully about how we bring this into our breeding program. So if there's particular weaknesses, then certainly it might be something to add to the selections when we're thinking about bulls. But we probably should exercise a little bit of caution just to remember that, to look for bulls that are good for dairy strength, but also good for the other traits that you I think are really important for your herd. And some of those relationships are unfavorable, so it's good to just pay a little bit of extra careful attention in that space if we're working with dairy strength. Certainly one of the cases where bigger isn't always better. In general terms, we express the type breeding values as a group from a base of 100. And what that means is that if we want to make improvements, then we can generally look for breeding values that are above 100. Now, that's not always the case, because as we've talked through this series, bigger isn't always better, and there's some traits where that's not appropriate too. But in general rule, the higher bulls are above 100. And if we're wanting to improve type as a whole, then the overall type trait's a nice breeding value to work with, as it takes into account the ideals that are set by the breed organizations. And so the higher type bulls are bulls that are above 100 for overall type. Now, one thing you'll have noticed in your Good Bulls app recently, if you've opened it up, have a look and see that the new composites are there. This app is obviously fantastic for working with traits like dairy strength or other traits where you want to look for high genetic merit bulls, but you might want to filter for particular criteria that are important to the individual farm that you're working with, whether it be dairy strength or fertility or protein kilos, whatever it happens to be. So the app makes it easy to use some filters to select from the top group of bulls, bulls that meet those extra criteria that you might have. Now, if you open up your app and you don't see the composites, if your phone hasn't kind of automatically done some fancy updates for you, the easiest way is just to delete that app, go to the App Store and reinstall it to make sure you've got a fresh copy, a top copy that's got the composites in. So if you don't see those composites, it's a good idea to ditch that copy of the app and download a fresh copy if that's not already there for you. In DataVat, you'll notice that for both bulls and cows that the composite traits have been added to the DataVat animal search menu. So you can pop on and have a look at the individual breeding values for those composites, as well as heel depth and mastitis resistance. The new calving knees and things, gestation length that were introduced in April are all on DataVat as well. Now, if you'd like some details on a little bit more content about the breeding values, there's quite a wealth of information on the DataGene website. Some fact sheets that are really quick reads, tech notes that are more for the enthusiast audience, and if you want the whole bottle and you want to spend some time on it, there's some genetic backgrounders that are some can be a little bit lengthy, but they have a lot of detail in it if you're really looking for something specific. And of course, sing it to the DataGene team if you've got some questions as well. Now, I just want to make sure, just to recognize that these new breeding values don't come to fruition by themselves. We work closely with our partners at Dairy Bio, Agriculture Victoria, the Gardner Foundation, and Dairy Australia, who have either conducted or supported the research that's led to the new traits. But they can't do their work without the important role that the data suppliers also make to this process. So farmers that classify their animals, for example, breed organizations that are collecting this data, bull companies that support the LT evaluation system, herd test centers, and dairy software providers are all fundamental to making this, this package work. So I know we've had a few more traits in this one, so we've run a little bit longer than some of the others, but keen to hear if there's any questions that you want to raise at this point, or Leanne, if you've picked up any questions in the chat box that you want to share now.
No, I haven't picked up any questions, but everyone is able to unmute themselves if they'd like to ask a question. I do have a question not related to this, but related to future webinar topics. We'd be interested to know what topics people might be interested in for future, because we're just about at the end of our type series. Next week, we're going to look at, have a bit of a data vat demo in the lead up to the August ABV release.
It's all a bit quiet, but that's okay, guys. Feel free to pop an email through to us if you've got some questions. More than happy to, or pick up the phone. More than happy to work through those as best we can. If there aren't any other questions popping up, look, I want to thank Rohan for joining us today. It's great to have your expertise involved, Rohan, to go through those traits in a lot of detail. So I certainly appreciate your assistance there. Thanks to Leanne and to Ali for organizing the webinar today to make sure that we're off and running and don't make too many mistakes. So yeah, I wish everyone a great day. Please remember that we'll have another one next Thursday at 12:30. So share this around with colleagues or staff, people that you think might be interested in. Let them know that they're welcome to join us as well. Great to see you all today, and have a good one.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle.